I guess in my 52-year railroad career, I have walked to the moon and back on railroad platforms just like this in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I've come to know there are a lot of untold stories and even a few secrets out there involving the railroad industry. Please join us and subscribe so we can continue to bring you those untold stories and even a few secrets from America's railroad past.
All aboard! Highball it, Eagle!
Have you heard the travel news about the Eagle Way? To your destination happening every day. The Texas Eagle is clicking on the rail. From the Windy City to the Alamo, meet you at the station, come on, let's go. People get ready and catch the wave. Catch the wave, the Texas Eagle Way. Through the heart of the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my podcast. I've seen some trains before. Thank you for joining us again. And we are honored and privileged to have literally a career-long friend of mine, Phoebe Snow. If you rode an Amtrak train in the 20th century or the first decade of the 21st century, we are looking at the woman responsible for most of Amtrak's services and policies and equipment in onboard services during that time. I know, Phoebe, that your backstory here is going to be of interest to so many people. I can't wait till we get to the Pacific Parlor Car and how that came about. I know that was one of your signatures. But I want to begin at the beginning. Where are you from? As we say in the South, where were you born and reared?
I grew up in a suburb north of Chicago, Glencoe, on the lake, about 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Chicago. And spent my first 18 years there. It's where I fell in love with the railroad, actually, because my father was from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and his family was in Raton, Roy, and Albuquerque, and we would take trips on the Santa Fe Railroad. So here I was at 7 years of age, our first trip that I remember just falling in love with the El Capitan, ironically sitting in the very lounge car that became the Pacific Parlor Cars. And I thought, even at 7, I was blown away by the uniqueness of passenger trains, the dining cars, the lounge, the experience, meeting people, your panoramic view of the countryside. And each year, my love affair increased. And so with that, I had that love. But as you know, growing up in the 60s, the railroads were in a rush to discontinue every long distance train across the country. And when Amtrak was created in 71 in May, it was to save a minimal network of trains, so at least you could go from point A to point B in some cases. But so I went off to college in my 18th year, off to New York City to Fordham, under the impression that I was going to get a degree in journalism. That was my major. I loved to write, still do. And I was going to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, the Watergate reporters, or maybe Mike Royko, the most famous journalist in Chicago. I was gonna nail it all. But unfortunately, at 18, New York, back then they set drinking ages by the state. It was not a national age. And so it was 18. It caused quite a bit of destruction for me. And the Killarney Rose sold me a shot of vodka for 25 cents legally. And then there were not so legal drugs. And so I was not a good student, but I loved New York City, Greenwich Village, the music scene, the psychedelics, everything, but definitely not a good student, barely surviving academically. And so I got a call from my mother, who I hardly was getting along with, Griff, in 1973, and she said, I got to tell you something. Amtrak's hiring 100 reservation agents. They're taking over reservations from the railroad. And I said, all right, Mom, so why are you telling me this? She said, I'll tell you why. Because you've loved trains since you were this high, and 4 or 5, and you should always pursue something that you have passion for, because then it's not really work. It's just something you love and you can devote yourself to and enjoy it. And I said, well, Mom, I'm getting a degree in journalism, if you don't mind, and I just don't know if that really makes sense. And she said, let me be honest with you. Your grades stink. You're barely making it at school. You'll be lucky to graduate. And if you do graduate, you'll be lucky to get a job at the Asbury Park, New Jersey local paper. I remember her saying that. And she said, but with Amtrak, sky's the limit. And who knows what'll happen. You should pursue it, and then you can always go back to journalism if Amtrak doesn't make it or something happens where it's disbanded, but you'll kick yourself if you don't pursue it. And so I said, Mom, I gotta go. And I hung up and then thought about it and thought, hey, I hate to admit it, really hate to admit it, but my mother is right. And I called her back and said, give me the info. And I applied, and Amtrak was good enough to hire me, and it was the beginning of the most extraordinary career to do something you love and have a chance to go to the service department, which is exactly what I love, being with people, working on making Amtrak service better, making customers happier, helping employees reach their potential by believing in them and helping them, remove obstacles to their own greatness. And so all because of my mother and that fateful phone call. And so I started as a reservation agent, and then
Phoebe, where did you start? Were you at the old Fort Washington facility? In Chicago?
In Chicago at the old Santa Fe building. It now says
okay
on it, but it was 80 East Jackson, and
right.
Started answering phones the week of the Arab oil embargo. And so I remember supervisor asking me, do you have any interest in overtime? And I said, you mean like over 40 hours? He said, yeah, because the phones are ringing off the hook because of the gas lines and shortages. And he said, we've never had business like this. Would you like some overtime? I said, how much? And he said, how much do you want? I said, as much as you'll give me. And he said, how about 40 hours of work and 40 hours of overtime? And I said, Peter Stewart was his name. You may remember him, but
I do.
Peter Stewart. And he said, tell you what I'll do. If you're going to work 18 hours in a day, you could just sleep in the lounge and then get up at 6 in the morning and start in again. And that first week on the job, I worked 87 hours and loved every second of it. I couldn't believe they were paying me to help customers find a way to travel on Amtrak. And it was...
And you slept in the lounge at the Chicago reservations office? I
did, because they closed it at midnight and reopened at 6.
That's right. Yes.
Time when I was working beginning to end of both shifts, essentially 16 to 18 hours. And so I would sleep on the lounge maybe 2 nights a week on one of the sofas there. That's true. The rate of pay was not so great for entry level, but I had more money than I'd ever had in my life with all the overtime coming in. And more importantly, I loved it. I got to talk to customers. I got to help them. And it was everything I ever wanted in a job, in terms of customer service. And it quickly blossomed into supervision and then into management and superintendent. And for the most part, a dream come true.
Well, let's take it step by step here. Let me make an observation. I believe I have 7 episodes now up and running on my podcast, but I have about a dozen, maybe a little bit more already in production. And I'm amazed at the number of railroad people like myself and yourself who freely admit that they wanted to go to work for the railroad since childhood. I didn't think that thread was going to be as common a bond as I'm hearing in these stories. But what I think is so significant about yours, for our younger viewers especially, ladies and gentlemen, the Santa Fe chief, super chief, and El Capitan that Phoebe is talking about growing up riding, those were 3 trains in America that had not lost their luster. So you were experiencing the height of Santa Fe service from 1948. It hadn't diminished yet.
I think you're making a great point, and that probably added to the luster of the experience for me is the impeccable service level of the waiters, the dining car steward. I actually rode with John Gillis one trip. He was the first African-American steward ever on the Santa Fe. And then
Wow.
we worked together in Chicago in 1983 when he was general supervisor. And these were people of such class and grace and dignity and service. It was all about service. And then the Pullman porters, since at that time the sleeping cars were separately managed by the Pullman company, were the best of the best. I revered them. I just, their willingness to work so long, so many hours, so gracious, and yet so much prejudice in the world at the time. And then, when I read more about how the Pullman porters, so many of them sent their money home and their kids went off to college and became lawyers and doctors and bankers, and that's what was their children to have a life that exceeded theirs, as they put it. And so they were at the top of the list of heroes for me. And I mentioned this when the Oakland station Jack London Square was dedicated. Shortly after that, a book about the Pullman porters came out, and I was asked to MC the event. And we got 4 Pullman porters that were 91 to 97, and brought them to the event. And all of them still looked sharp, and they still had the Pullman look to them. And I just basically spent a few minutes saying, growing up as a child, they were my absolute heroes. And
absolutely,
it was to be able to honor them and recognize them at Oakland. And one of the many things in my career at Amtrak that was a genuine pleasure for me and an honor to be able to do it.
Pullman porters of that era who were in their 90s would have seen Pullman Company service at its zenith. They would have been there at the height.
Exactly right. Exactly
Wow.
right. But Griff, I've always had a kind of personality that I guess you'd call it a service personality. I get genuine pleasure out of taking care of people and making them happy, which is why even as a superintendent, I spent half my time on the train, because that's where my happiness came from, being with employees that were delivering the service and asking them what could we make better, or what's not working that we can fix, and being with customers, sitting down right next to them and introducing myself and saying, how's your trip going? Is there something you think we're not doing that we should do? What a joy to be able to be on those trains so much of the time, even as superintendent and general manager, and even when I was vice president of the Eastern region. The love of being with people and making them happy has always been central to my life, and I put that squarely at the feet of my mother, who taught from the earliest age the power of service. I mean, so I'm grateful to her, even though I couldn't stand her for much of my youth. She taught me some wonderful things.
Phoebe, take us then from, okay, so you took a promotion as a supervisor in the Chicago Res office. Is that correct?
I actually put in Washington, 6 months of reservation work, and forgive me if I'm bragging here, but I had 9 letters of thank you. Back then, there was no email and all, but 9 letters of customers who wrote to the manager, a guy named Brian Pettyjohn, about how helpful I'd been and how I saved a trip for them. And you know, you need more people like Brian Rosenwald. I get like a letter every couple of weeks in. And so he calls me in one day and says, would you like to go to Washington for an interview for a job in management? And it turned out it was the only job I ever had that I did not like. Tariff analyst, taking these books of rates and fares and tariffs. And all day I spent in the basement of L'Enfant Plaza changing fares and prices. But here's the key: no customers, no people, just these books of fares. But it did get me in management, and that was so important to me because I was on a mission to rescue Amtrak and to change it for the better. And
well, you did. You did rescue Amtrak and change it for the better. You did do that, Phoebe. So make no mistake, that's part of your legacy in this company, that from coast to coast. I do have to ask this question: was my friend Vince Hodge in that basement with you yet? You know, he was
I met Vince later.
Okay, he was. But see, he liked you and I didn't fit that category. Vince loved those tariffs and analyzing those tariffs, and I understand it. I didn't.
To be willing to do that type of work and love it. And
yes.
I clearly did not love it, but I hung in there, and then got into the operating department and space and equipment control, making concepts.
Okay, how did that happen? How did you, I mean, in the basement at L'Enfant Plaza, ladies and gentlemen, Amtrak's original corporate headquarters in the 70s, how did they know you were down there to come and rescue you and get you into operation?
That's a great, extremely good question. I met some people that were in operations planning, one of them, Don Matthews, and he told me what type of work he did, which was analysis of trains, their performance in terms of food and beverage, general revenue, cost, but it was like a maze or a puzzle trying to figure out how to improve business performance, because none of the trains were making a profit, but the goal was to maybe improve performance by changing schedule, changing service, changing some aspect of it. So anyways, he told me that, and I said, Don, listen, I'm here in tariffs, and I can do this job with my eyes closed, but I would be willing to work for you at no charge, and after I finish here at 4:30, I'll just come up and I'll start doing the analysis for you of any and all trains you want. And he said, "Are you serious?"
Yeah, yeah. He didn't hear that every day of the week.
And I said, "No, Don, because that's more up my alley, doing work about train performance, and plus it kind of gets me out of the basement here and gets me some visibility." So I did that for Don at no charge. Generally speaking, worked from 4:30 to about 9, most weeknights. And that allowed me to meet a number of people, including the vice president, David Watts, another hero of mine from the B&O Railroad. And
yes,
he hired me. This was the beginning of a big jump as special officer to the vice president. My job was to write the journalism background, getting some use, reports for him, analysis for him, to go out to a mechanical facility and evaluate the performance of it, and to be kind of his right-hand person. And I loved it. Loved. That was another wonderful job. And he was one of the most brilliant, magnificent people I had ever met. And unfortunately, he got caught up with union difficulties and was forced out and fired by the Ellen Boyd. And all of a sudden, I found myself without a vice president. And the new one came in. Robert Herman said to me, I don't need a special officer. That was for Dave Watts, not for me. And so that's when I then went to my friend Willard Keeney, who was the manager of the control and ops center. And he took me in, and that's when I started doing consist for trains. It was kind of from the tariff department to operations planning unofficially to special officer to the vice president, and then into the operating department in 1978.
When you said you got into consist for trains, what does that mean? Were you actually making up trains?
Your job was to line up the right equipment, add cars for groups, subtract cars when business went down, send cars to other places if you had big groups coming up. Essentially, you worked with the yards to put together the next day's or the next week's consist so that the train had the right number of sleeping car beds, right number of coach seats, and it matched the demand for the day. So I did that.
Wow.
Year
Well,
and a half.
let me do an aside here real quick. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about, and it's a railroad term, we're talking about the Armstrong method. There were no pens. I mean, there were no computers or electronic equipment. You did this with pen in hand and paper. So
And
what I hear you
sheets of paper. Yes, that's correct.
what I hear you telling me is you were in revenue management for this company 15 years before the company had revenue management.
Precisely right. And
Wow.
to you, Mr. Hubbard.
Well, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I loved that job because part of the job was going out and going to the yards and seeing the equipment. We still had all the old dome cars. There wasn't
Yes.
superliner equipment yet. So we had the old domes and old sleepers and heritage diners. So it was a lot of fun to be responsible for trains like the Montrealer from Washington to Montreal with the pub car. And I loved it, but I still had my eyes set 100% on onboard service. That was the only place I wanted to end up, with station service being a runner-up, but onboard service was better because that's where the product is. That's where you make or break your customer satisfaction. And I said to myself, I'll use this to get into onboard service, and that opportunity came just 2 years later.
You know, an aside that you don't know about, something magnanimous that you did for me and for Dave Marshall, but it was Dave's request. Around in California Zephyr Dome that was already in Amtrak colors, but Dave and I were headed out to LA for something or another, and Dave got you to put that car on for our trip on those dates, and you did. And I can remember sitting in that dome with him, and we would chuckle on that trip because it was just full. You know, I think it had a drawing room in it, if I'm not mistaken.
Memories did.
That was sold. We didn't get that drawing room. But anyway, being in that car and the people that were just loving it, and Dave and I would sit there and think, if they had any knowledge of how this car ended up on this train on this trip, that was because of you, Phoebe. Thank you.
Oh, it
That
goes.
that was probably about 1978.
That's right. That's right. And so in April of 1980, in a reorganization, a woman by the name of Rima Parkhurst,
Yes.
who I think
No stranger to a curse word.
exactly. Oh, the crudest of crude. But she took a liking to me and offered me any East Coast onboard manager's job I wanted, which at the time would have been Boston, New York, or Washington. Philadelphia had already been filled, and it didn't have onboard. The Washington, New York, and Boston all did. And I immediately took Boston because I was totally in love with that city and totally in love with New England. And there's just something, I was so fond of Boston from my train trips in the 70s. And so I became manager of onboard, and I did have the stations under me too,
Yes.
South Station, Providence, Route 128, et cetera. But the real excitement came because I managed the old parlor cars, the old Pennsylvania parlor cars, swivel seats, and they still had dining cars when I was there. And on the Merchants Limited, you could get a prime rib for $4.50. Leaving New York for Boston at 6 o'clock at night, and I thought, this is too great to be true. And I had 100, I think it was 138 employees, small by the standards of Chicago or Los Angeles, but it was so exciting. And I think I spent probably 80% of my time on the trains with the LSAs who ran the bar cars and the club cars. And I knew I had found where I wanted to spend the rest of my career, which was directly with customers, making the experience better. That's everything I loved. And literally for the next 30 years of Amtrak, that's what I did, from Boston to Chicago to Detroit to Los Angeles to Oakland to Jacksonville, Florida, to back to Chicago. And then all of it was service related, which just meant everything to me. The happiness, the satisfaction, everything, Griff, was all about the service. And I knew I never wanted to leave and go anywhere else if it wasn't in the service department. And I was lucky enough, in spite of my outspoken personality, that they never got rid of me. They allowed me to operate for 30 years in customer service, and it was a dream come true, Griff.
I think the word here to describe you is passion.
It indeed.
But I have a question. Do you have any idea? Is Miss Parkhurst still with us?
I don't know. I don't know.
I heard.
Yeah,
I heard that she was, but if you will permit, I want to tell you a very quick Rima Parkhurst story, Rima Z Parkhurst story. Here's she took a liking to me too, and I was grateful for that. And we stayed in contact during her Amtrak tenure. She was vice president of passenger services, I think was the term in those years.
correct.
But anyway, she was doing an inspection trip on the Inter-American. As you well know, that's the Amtrak service that predated the Texas Eagle. And I was called upon to ride with her from Fort Worth to Texarkana. And she was not in a business car, private car. She was in line space, and she had Brian Gallagher with her, not the later Brian Gallagher, but the Brian Gallagher of the 70s. I don't know if you remember him or not, but nice guy. He was kind of her spokesperson, I guess, in a way. But anyway, at Fort Worth, the Texas and Pacific Railway train crew got on, and the conductor got on. I had known him, as you well know, I came from the TNP, and I had known him in my TNP service, so I knew it wasn't surprising to me, but he got on board, and he had a big 10-gallon white cowboy hat on and jeans, and a leather vest and boots and short spurs. And I saw her, now she's vice president of this company, and a man clearly he had nothing that was a vestige of a uniform other
Right.
and I saw her size that situation up, and knowing her, I thought this is not going to be good. And here's when I realized Rima Z. Parkhurst was a smart woman. From Fort Worth to Texarkana, where he got off, not once did she address that issue. And I could see those wheels turn. Smart lady, what are you going to do here? This is one of those situations you just better let it be.
I I totally agree, and I think she was right to use diplomacy and
She she
treatment. That was the right move.
So, all right, you're in Boston, and do you think this is where you're going to be? Do you think you have found a permanent home, or were you looking to move?
Well, I loved Boston and loved being in onboard service, yes, but my ambitions were high, and right around the time I got there, a year later, all the Amfleet arrived for New England, and that was the end of dining car service, and it crushed me. And then the end of club, the old club cars were all gone, old Pennsy, and so it was very painful to have to deal with a kind of sterile, less attractive, I think, less desirable service. So my goal was to get to a crew base that had dining and sleeping cars where I thought I could make the most difference. So that meant either Chicago or LA, for example, Seattle, New Orleans, etc. And Frank Forcione tapped me to go to Chicago to work for Darrell Bryan at the time in 1983, and that began a 20-year period of working with dining, lounge, sleeper, and long distance trains. Probably the greatest love of my life.
I've already spoken of this in another podcast, so I'll make it very brief. Did you know my dear friend, onboard service attendant? He was an ex-Pennsylvania man, Curtis Bradley. Does that name ring a bell, or did you know Curtis at all?
Does it ring a bell? I
Okay.
thought I knew everyone. I must have missed a few.
Well, he was senior man, and he worked the Inter-American St. Louis to Laredo. Curtis Bradley, but the point of the story
He
is
worked as a supervisor, onboard and service inspector, then chief of
no,
onboard.
no. He was a dining car waiter and a lounge car attendant.
Okay, so he was in the crew in one of the dining car crews. Okay,
Frontline man.
I'm
But
not sure.
I've already
never crossed.
I've already put this in another podcast, but I'll make it brief because I know you'll love it. We had the SP Diner Lounge on the Inter-American, with the Texas bar in it. And that Curtis considered that his car. And the first trip of Amfleet, I got on that Am Cafe to deliver ice or whatever had been ordered at Texarkana. And Curtis looked me right in the eye and he said, "Hubbard, this ain't nothing but a goddamn McDonald McMuffin car."
I totally agree.
And compared to that SP Diner Lounge, I thought he's right on target.
Yeah. I share that sentiment. Before we move on too much further, I've been remiss. I should tell you one story that I think probably changed the career trajectory for me in such a dramatic way. As I mentioned, I was highly ambitious and highly competitive. And I said to myself, I am going all the way up the ranks. I'm going to be the president of Amtrak because no one's going to outwork me, and no one knows more about Amtrak, and no one is more devoted than me. This is the way I'm thinking. And so I did get like 3 promotions in 3 years, high ratings, performance reviews. I was rolling, and I thought there's no stopping me because I can't be stopped because I outwork everyone. I'm just being honest with you. And then
That's what we want.
not long, I went to Boston. I was 27, and Willard Keeney had left and was replaced by Ron Scalero, who you may remember had come in from Pan Am, and a truly wonderful human being who changed my life. But anyways, you get your annual review, 1 to 5, 1 being the best. And I was used to getting a 1, and it would just say how much work I do, invaluable, and then I'd sign it, and that'd be it for a year. And in 1979, the year before I went up to Boston, Ron gave me my review, and it was a 1. But there was an area called Areas for Improvement. And I have never, it just shook me to the core. He wrote that Brian needs to decide whether he wants to be the smartest person at Amtrak or he wants to be a great leader. Because if he wants to be the smartest person at Amtrak, it said this, I'm not paraphrasing, who knows, he might already be there. But if he wants to be a great leader, he has much work to do. And then it just lambasted me for my ego and my, my clerk. I had 4 clerks that worked for me, and I would send them home with pay and do their work. And he said, Brian thinks that's something generous, but it's not. It makes those clerks feel that they're not worthwhile and that only Brian knows how to do the work perfectly or the best. And, then it went on to say that I went out of my way to show people how much I knew. And he said, this is the great line. He said, the key to leadership is that you put your ego aside and you realize that great leaders find ways to help the people that work for you reach their greatness. That's what leaders do, is they achieve greatness through the people that work for them, by finding their gifts, by finding the things that motivate them, that inspire them, by supporting them, by them knowing that you have their back, but especially believing in them. And he said, Brian has to decide whether he's he's up for doing any of that or whether he just wants to stay on the path of the brightest person that ever worked for Amtrak. And I remember, Griff, when I got that review, read that part, I was so angry at Ron that I stood up. You have to sign the review, whether you agree or not. So I did sign it. And I said, Ron, I'm leaving. I don't want to talk to you because I'm going to say things that I'm going to regret. And so I said, thanks for the review. I can't believe you said these things about me after all the work I've done for you. And I left. And at the time, I had a girlfriend who had worked in the legal department. So I went home and I told her it was the worst day of my life, at Amtrak, and I'd been stabbed in the back by Ron, and it was horrible. And she said, well, what did he say? I told her, and she said, well, you're really going to be upset with me, but yeah, that does sound like you a lot. And she said, that's really wonderful that he would take the time to tell you whether you want to be a great leader or you want to go down a egomaniacal path and to, spouting off about how great you are. And I laid in bed that night and I realized that it was my mother again. You got to be the best. You got to outwork everyone. In our family, you had to be the best. And I became that person early in my Amtrak career. And I am forever grateful that Ron saw how this was hindering my chance to be a better person and a better leader. In fact, I was no leader at all prior to this. And I came in the next morning, I apologized to Ron, and I said, I thank you so much for having the courage and the willingness to care enough about me that you would say those things, knowing I would blow up at you. And he said, I did know that. He said, but I believe in you. And I figured this could help you. And I said, Ron, from this day forward, it's about the people that work for me. And I think when I had the Co-Starlight, it was Ron's influence 14 years earlier that allowed me to get 400 employees to really believe in what we were doing on the Starlight and to believe in themselves and to know that I was behind them all the way and that this was their train, not mine, and to not worry about the rule book, just worry about one thing. No one gets off the train who hasn't had a good experience, and you can do anything in the book or outside of the book if it's take care of a customer, and you will never be anything but celebrated. But the whole idea of appreciating people and getting the best out of them, I owe that all to Ron. And from that review on, I worked diligently to be a different person, different type of manager and a different type of leader. And I think my career was profoundly influenced because of what Ron was willing to do for me. And, it's, I'm just forever grateful. And one last thing I'll say about that is when Ron retired, I was very good friends with Ron, and he's a very funny man. And I was asked to be part of a roast where we would all tell stories about Ron and what he had done. He was a pretty irreverent guy. And I had several stories, but at the event, when I went up there, I said, I could roast Ron for an hour or two and it wouldn't be difficult, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell everyone in this room how that man changed my life forever. And then I told the story that I've just told you, Griff, that, and I said, Ron, I just wanted to thank you once more before you retired. The power and influence of what you said to me forever changed me. And in the end, I think Amtrak was a better place because of your willingness to be honest and caring in a way that very few people are. And anyway, so, that I tell that story only to say there was early Brian and there was later Brian. And I look back on those first few years and I think how insufferable I was, just always wondering if someone else was gaining on me and outworking me or in favor with a vice president, and I just realized that it's just not the way to be successful. If you help your people become great, then that's the gift. And whether you get promoted or not, and I was lucky enough to go almost to president. My mother never could quite accept that I didn't make it. Vice president, not good enough for her, but still, all because someone believed in me enough to help me change the trajectory of my wayward ways as an early manager. And sometimes in life, you can have a person that can do that for you. And I hope some people that worked on the Starlight in some ways might say that about me. I don't know that, but I hope I was able to change other people the way Ron changed me for the better. And if I did that, then I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that.
Phoebe, are you not aware, and you may not be, although we have briefly discussed it in previous conversations, just personal conversations, are you not aware of the iconic legacy following you have across this whole country in Amtrak Onboard services? I mean, from Amtrak corporate to Trains Magazine to National Association of Railroad Passengers, or I think it's RPA now. I can't name an organization that doesn't equate you with the best of what Amtrak had to provide.
Well, much of that, the apex was the Starlight, the New York Times, NBC television did an onboard story about the Co-Starlight and my crew and myself. and the LA Times travel section, and so many accolades came my way, a presidential award. And I don't know. I don't think about legacy too much. I think about gratitude that someone like me got a chance to do the very thing he dreamed of doing when he was 6 or 7 years old. And how many people can ever say that and mean it sincerely? And so, when I was featured in a book called Great Railway Journeys of the
Yes.
World, I thought,
Yes.
wow, that's amazing, that I've been this recognized. And it's, Griff, it's not always easy, but I think humility is the greatest gift that a person can have, because if you're truly humble, you know that you're not only not perfect, you're flawed. You have things that just need to be worked on. And you know that no matter how good you are at a given moment, there's a better opportunity, a better way to do something, and that life is all about learning. And I think humility is the greatest gift that a person can have. And I don't think I had it at all early on, but as I got older and realized how just amazing it was to see people reach their full potential and do things that they themselves might not have believed they could do, that leads to humility. Just the realization that we all have shortcomings, but you try to rise above them. And so I'm aware of some of the iconic stuff you're talking about, and it was fun to ride the train to Starlight. Later on, I get on the train, walk in the parlor car, and people would say, there he is. That's the guy. And people, I'm not kidding, would ask for my autograph, and
Yes.
it was really something for a while, and I loved it. I can't deny it. I just loved the fact that people were so gracious and excited about it. So I did know that, Griff. Yes.
I've had the opportunity to thank you privately about this on several occasions, but I've never thanked you publicly. Although you had no way of knowing that I was just one person who was never going to leave the South. But when you offered me the district supervisor's job at Toledo, Ohio, do you realize that at that time, Brian Rosenwald has offered me that, if you're looking at me, I can't tell you what a compliment I considered that 40 years ago, and I still consider it a compliment because
not get you out of Texas, though, could I?
Well, yeah, you could not, because you asked. And I just want you to know that was a high point in my railroad career, just to have been offered that by you. Thank you again.
Griff, when I look back and, thought about this a lot the last few years, all the people I met from all walks of life and all positions and all parts of the country. And it's the greatest part of Amtrak, right? The people you meet, the people whose friendship means everything to you, and
Yes.
we talked about it to people like Joy Smith and
Yes.
Dave Marshall, and hundreds of people that have crossed my path and who will forever be a part of the wonderful memories that I have of a 40-year and 1 week career.
40-year and 1 week. Well,
That's right.
let's go back. When you were working for Ron Scalero, your title was
Unit Supervisor, Northeast Corridor.
Okay. So are you launched from that point into National Onboard Services? What happened when Ron retired? What happened?
What happened was one of the clerical positions was held by Karen Tremblay, a wonderful friend of mine, and she had gotten to know Rima Parkhurst and told Rima, "You got to meet Brian. This guy is something." And that's how I met Rima. And then Rima was reorganizing, you may recall, the department and putting a lot of new faces in what was largely nepotism. Places like New England were 100% family hierarchy. I never would have gotten to Boston if not for Rima's enlightened approach to putting people in that had no family connection to anyone in Boston. And so I went from unit supervisor to manager onboard and station service Boston. Yes, from Ron to Boston, correct.
Okay, so from Boston, I guess what path led you into the national system?
Well, as I said, I had arrived in customer service, but it was being kind of dismantled with the elimination of heritage, old equipment, and the elimination of all dining service, which I loved and was passionate about, and then the elimination of the club cars, and then you had these Amfleet club cafes that weren't really
McDonald McMuffin cars.
Yeah. Yes. And so I said to myself, I do love this work, but if I get a chance to go into a big crew base with the traditional long distance service, I think that's where I belong. And then Frank Forcione offered me a chance to come to Chicago 3 years after I had arrived in Boston. And then I was the manager of a 500-person crew base with plenty of dining cars.
Wow. And you were back home or in your home environs.
Indeed, that is true. And I lived in Evanston at the time. My first child had just been born in my last year in Boston, so I had first of two children, and I lived in Evanston, which is actually where I was born, hospital-wise, and so I was home, but not for long. I had ended up in a district manager job in Detroit, and which I loved, and that's where I met Frank Stoy, who you may have known, but
Yes.
Another amazing human being, and he worked for me in Toledo, and so that was good. But from there off to Los Angeles, working for Lynn Barbarian, and having the biggest crew base in the country, plus
Yes.
stations. That is where I really knew that I had found the home I wanted to stay at. And then there was this horrible reorganization that affected Lynn and me and hundreds of others. I was sent to Oakland for a crew base of 80 people from a crew base of 500 with no explanation. And they just said, either you go or you're fired. And I went, and then I was taking the buyout that was offered to management. And I was going to leave and go to work for a winery, since I was in the Bay Area. Napa was only an hour away. And I thought, I'm done with Amtrak. If they're going to do this to me and treat me this badly, I'm done. And then Lee Bullock came. At the time, he was the superintendent, but yet another reorganization was going on with Tom Downs, and they were creating product lines where the decisions about a train would be made at the local level, which was the real dream. Because let's face it, Griff, until that happened, until Tom Downs was willing to do something that bold, if I was the manager of, say, the Southwest Chief, and I wanted to try a menu of maybe regional specials, some New Mexican cuisine, or Kansas barbecue, or I always associated these trains with the routes and trying to bring product and kind of theme them so the route became part of the service. But you couldn't do that. You had to go before corporate menu committees and food and beverage people and finance and procurement. And basically, Tom Downs saw that the local management no, even if they were superintendents or general managers or directors, really had no power to change a damn thing because the power was in corporate. And the negative was that most people in corporate didn't know anything about the service on a train. And
Let me, Phoebe,
Yeah.
let me make sure I understand. You mean if a manager on site wanted to change a dining car menu item, that
Mhm.
had to be run by a committee back at corporate?
Right, you had to submit a proposal, you had to send product to them if depending on if it was a vendor making the product for you to cook. You had to write a justification, you had to put the cost in and the reasons you wanted to do it, and then it would go before a menu committee, which consisted of like 8 people: procurement, finance, I think marketing was in it, and procurement had veto power. So if the product was 50 cents more per serving than the average of the existing products, it wasn't going to make it. And you could argue all day long, but I was getting so frustrated with my inability to do the things that I thought could help trains that I managed, and I just couldn't get it done. But with the product lines, that power left corporate totally, and I could do anything. And it helped that I worked for Gil Mallory, who told me shortly after he became the president of Amtrak West, he said, Brian, he said, you don't have to come to me to ask permission about anything because you know more about this train than anyone. And he said, don't come to me for permission. You do whatever you think is right for this train, and you come to me if you have a problem. But if you just want to do things that you think help the train, 100% support. And so that was the joy of it, right? That I could sit down with my chefs and my food specialists and my waiters and many of whom were very talented, right? And say,
Absolutely.
let's think about what we can create if we're in charge, because we are in charge now. And so the Coast Starlight was all about regional cuisine, seafood from the Pacific Northwest, salads from Salinas, the salad bowl capital, tri-tip barbecue from Santa Barbara, Santa Maria Valley. And so the Starlight was not only a wonderful train, but the dining car became a way to showcase the wonderful culinary traditions of the route of California, Oregon, and Washington. Never something I could have done before the product lines, and it's why more fame came my way with the Starlight than anything else, is because the freedom for a person like me was intoxicating. And some product line directors didn't do much of anything. The personality wasn't perhaps suited to it. But for me, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity at a bureaucratic company. And Griff, I think you would have experienced a lot of bureaucracy with your revenue management and, you know, trying to do what's right for the train and knowing more about the Eagle than probably anyone in corporate. And yet, you know, the dynamic of who had the final say, and you achieved such remarkable things in spite of that difficulty. A tribute to you and your perseverance and tenaciousness and passion. And but with the product lines in '95, I could do whatever I thought was right for the train, and it was beyond magnificent. It was everything I hoped for. I actually would sometimes go home at night and think, I cannot believe I have the most perfect job in the world, because I did think that.
If memory serves me, I think it was your influence on Joy Smith that all of a sudden we started serving Texas barbecue on the Texas Eagle.
I told
I think that came from you.
The idea did, but all credit to Joy and her team for getting it done. I told her, I said, Joy, the Texas Eagle, you've got to think about having some signature items that represent the bounty of the route of the train. And I said, for example, with a state like Texas in the name of the train, and you go from one end to the south end, and I said, wouldn't barbecue be perfect? And she said, yeah, you might be right. And then it did lead to that. So all credit to Joy.
So, what was your job title when you were transferred to LA? What product line director?
Was manager on board Boston, then manager on board Chicago, then district manager Detroit, and then district manager Los Angeles. The difference being that with the district manager, you had onboard and stations. That's the way they defined it. So that's why when I worked for Lynn, I think with the stations, I had a total of 700 people, the most I had up to that point in my career. And I worked for Lynn for 6 years till the reorganization of Art McMahon and Chuck Bothwell. Yes. That led to the one moment probably in my career where I said, I think I'm doomed, because I just didn't think I could get out of Oakland, and I was stuck there, and this reorganization had taken the spark away from me, and I suddenly felt, I had no one I could turn to ask for help. And then Lee Bullock came to me and said, there's a reorganization going on right now, and I know you've taken the buyout, but they didn't necessarily approve the buyout. They could delay it. And Bob Van Wagner, who I worked for, had delayed it because new equipment was arriving in Oakland for the California car service on the San Joaquin. So even though I took the buyout, it was not effective until May of the next year. And I took it in November of 94. And so Lee says, this might ruin your plans to work for a winery, but there is a job, product line director for the Coast Starlight, and I'd be hard pressed to say there isn't a more, that you might be the most perfect person for that job, because you will have freedom that you couldn't even imagine. Anyways, I thought about it, and I thought, well, that might be the greatest. And so I applied, and Lee hired me. And 1 week into the job, we're out in the yard, and Lee says, what do you think the Starlight needs? And I said, the number one thing it needs as a train is a first-class lounge. I said, Lee, sleeping car people, which there were 3 sleepers, so 110, 112 people and 3 Superliner sleepers. I said, they go to the dining car, they come back to their room, and there's one sightseer lounge for 5 coaches with 320 coach passengers, first come, first serve. So the reality is that the sleeping car customer is isolated between the diner and the room, back and forth. There's no place else to go because the seats are gone. That lounge car is overrun with coach people that are loving it, but the sleeping car people are getting the short end, and they are paying a lot of money for not a great experience, in my opinion. And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, you see those beat up old cars that are in storage? And I was pointing to one of the high level Santa Fe lounges, all of which had been taken out of service in LA, and they were going to sell them because they now had enough Superliners to not need them. And the idea of a first-class lounge never crossed perhaps anyone's mind but me. So I said, Lee, you see these cars here? We can make a first-class lounge, and these cars are free because no one wants them. They want to scrap them or sell them for $1 or to a museum or whatever. We can take them and put them in service, and if we succeed, then maybe we could go to Beech Grove, where there are some master craftsmen, and rebuild these cars as the greatest lounge cars in the history of Amtrak. And sure enough, with some simple work, we added bookcases, we, added onboard amenities, wine tasting, entertainment, kids play area, all sorts of little things. But the car itself was still pretty old and run down, no matter how we tried to make it look. And but they loved it, because now the sleeping car people had their own car to come to. And our customer satisfaction scores on the Starlight climbed to the highest level ever in the history. CSI ratings, the monthly scores that on average were in the 70s, and we climbed into the mid 90s. Unheard of. I used to kid my dear friend, still my dear friend, Doug Varn, who had Auto Train. And I said, Doug, everyone talks about Auto Train being great, but who's got the higher customer satisfaction? Not you, Doug, me. So the customer has to over. And anyway, success, revenue went up, ridership went up, and we had found a home for these cars. And then Beech Grove helped me redesign these cars, and what came out of Beech Grove was nothing short of genius. And those cars ran for 21 years, making them quite old, of course, since they were built in the late 40s, early 50s. And but the renovated parlor car was a thing of such beauty. Swivel seats in honor of my memories of the Pennsylvania Railroad. We created a dining area there with kitchen, open bar instead of that closed-in pillbox. Everything about the car was to make it inviting and make it a sleeping car customer's private club. And it was a huge hit, and it changed the train in so many ways, and it led to so much recognition and fame. And I did it because I didn't think it was right for a sleeping car customer to pay $1,000 one way back then for a deluxe bedroom and be quarantined in his sleeping car room and have no place to go, right? It just seemed unethical to do that to people. And that's why I took the cars of my 7-year-old youth and turned them into something. It's funny, Griff, when you have an idea in your head, and then you can take that idea and make it physical, a reality. It's a wonderful thing, to carry a vision in your head and then see its beauty. I have to say, the key person who worked for me with the parlor car, Pat Gallagher, deserves all the credit, because he had the vision I had. We shared it together, and he was brilliant at design. And so much of what happened at Beech Grove was because of Pat. And I may have had the idea and the power, but really Pat was a total genius to be able to work with the Beech Grove folks and pull off what they pulled off. So that's the story of the Pacific parlor car.
Well, wait now. A couple of questions, please.
Sure.
Were you the one? Did you or is the name Pacific Parlor Car your signature? Did you do that? Okay.
Yeah,
what a wonderful
did,
brand.
I wanted to give it a name that said something about the route, hence the word Pacific. And I wanted to use parlor, although I used the English spelling with a U.
Yes, you did.
Because I wanted to suggest like a parlor car of old, and also like the English parlor room, the kind of intimate, exquisite, club-like atmosphere where people could go to congregate, but it was special, and it belonged to just those people that were lucky enough to have booked on that train. So Pacific Parlor Car, the name that did come from my head. Yes.
Right. I thought that it had, but I wanted to verify it. Second question: when you were showing Lee Bullock was those cars on the scrap line, which became the Pacific Parlor cars. Lee vice president? Was Lee president of Inner City yet, or was he still vice president?
What happened was Lee had been general superintendent in the old organization.
Yes.
Then in the new organization, he was vice president working for Gil Mallory, the president. So I
Yes.
worked for Lee, but shortly after I took the job, which Lee hired me for, Mr. Warrington, the president at the time, called Lee to Chicago to become the president of the inner city. So Lee was only VP for 8 months maybe, and then off he went to Chicago, and he will tell you that Chicago wasn't nearly as enjoyable as LA.
Yes.
The inner city was plagued with things that made it so difficult to achieve, genuine success. So many budget issues, cost-cutting issues, but Lee was a true loyalist, and off he went to Chicago. That's where he became president of the inner city.
When you were showing him those cars on the scrap line, were those ex-Santa Fe high-level lounges? What had they been from your youth? What were those cars?
Yeah, that's exactly right. They
Okay.
high-level diners, which ran on the Desert Wind, train 36 and 35 through Vegas and connected to the Zephyr at Salt Lake City. But the ones in LA were the lounges. They had the Kachina room downstairs, a little coffee house, and upstairs they had the seating, and Amtrak had used them because they were high-level cars. They were limited in where you could use them, and so they ran them on the Sunset Limited with other high-level equipment, high-level coaches, high-level diner, and Superliner sleepers. That was the first speed. But so they had a life for about 15 years, pretty much unrenovated as lounge car. The food service area was horrible. It looked like a pillbox out of World War II. The employee probably had an opening about 3 feet, and it was enclosed with stainless steel. And with the parlor car, I gutted it and I made it an open area, no stainless steel, no pillbox. I wanted my employees to be able to see the customer, and the customer would be able to see my employees. So anyways, Lee was instrumental in getting these cars. They'd been retired just a few months before because new Superliner 2s had arrived, and the Sunset was going to be all Superliner. And there went the need for those cars. They had no need anywhere on a Superliner train because they were considered obsolete, old, and they were pretty ugly. You may recall they were orange and black and pretty hideous color scheme that came out of the 70s at Amtrak. And it was Lee who went to Bob Burke, who was chief mechanical officer, and said, "Bob, could we take those cars out of service and run them on the Coast Star Line?" Now you think about this, and this is what you could never have done except with the product lines. To actually add a car to a train in pre-product lines would have meant business case, analysis, projections, what's the revenue increase, what's the cost increase, how much fuel will it add to the locomotive. You would have been tied up for years and probably been turned down because they would say, well, it costs more, but you don't need to do it to get people to ride. They would never understand that it was part of getting people to ride, and therefore a revenue enhancer. But anyways, we got those cars in a week instead of 2 years or a year. And we
Wow,
rolled
a week.
his friendship with Bob Burke, and that rescued those cars and led to their renaissance and ultimately their renovation in 97 and 98.
What is, I don't mean this to be a loaded question. I mean a very, very sincere business question. I never could figure this out. What is a good business reason why the Pacific Parlor car was ever canceled?
The primary reason was the mechanical department lobbied for years to get rid of them because parts had to be custom built. Remember, you had the Superliner fleet, which was tough enough because Pullman Standard went bankrupt, but it was still relatively easy, I guess, to get an air conditioner replacement. But everything about those parlor cars took a lot of work, and the mechanical department at corporate hated those cars. Now, the field mechanical people were magnificent. Those parlor cars were their baby, and they knew everything about those cars. Jerry Meskel and other people, they saved the day for me because they were hard to maintain. And so the number one argument about the parlor cars was they were incompatible with Superliners in terms of maintenance, and it was just too big a headache. And the second reason was, I think, more philosophical. You had a series of Amtrak presidents that could not fathom how a first-class lounge car could affect revenue, that you could pay for the cost of the parlor car with increased pricing and increased ridership. And we were able to show that with Mr. Downs, President Downs, and Mr. Warrington and Mr. Gunn. But when Mr. Boardman arrived, he did not accept that we needed to run a parlor car. He said, we're the only game in town. There's no competition for passenger trains. It's Amtrak or nothing. And you don't need to spend all this money to run a parlor car with an LSA, equipment maintenance, food, everything. So you had a philosophical argument against upgraded service, and then you had the mechanical corporate argument that the cars were too difficult to maintain. And in spite of that, they rolled on for another 10 years, and
They did.
rode the last run of it in 2018, I think, 5 years ago.
Yes. That must have been a poignant moment for you.
Well, it was poignant and beautiful at the same time. They put two of them on because there were a lot of rail enthusiasts that
Okay.
out for the last run, and I got to do a farewell wine tasting and meet some wonderful people. So it was bittersweet, melancholy, I think would be my way of looking at it. But I had to look at this from two vantage points. Yes, I was sad and disappointed, and it was really a painful thing. On the other hand, along with other people, we were able to keep these cars going for 23 years from the day of the Starlight. Cars that would have been wiped out or scrapped or sold for nothing. 23 years of service at Amtrak. So, I had to see it in positive light as well as my disappointment.
I can't imagine seeing your baby grow up and leave home, because that's what happened in that regard.
I had abandoned my child. Yeah.
Yes.
It hurt. But
and you may not remember this, but it was the second time you paid myself and Jesse Padilla the extreme compliment that neither Jesse nor myself have ever forgotten. You asked us to come work for you on the Coast Starlight product line.
Mhm.
So you didn't pay me one you paid me two supreme compliments, of which highlights of my career.
I had someone that I believed in and liked. I often tried a second time, but with you, I I don't think I would have succeeded if I tried 5 times, but
Yeah, Miss Smith
I
said
had to
she
try at least once more.
Miss Smith said she finally told you, baby, he ain't leaving Texas.
I think that's probably exactly how she said it to me.
I bet that's right. All right, so your product line director on the Starlight. One last question about the Pacific parlor cars. I don't know the answer to this question, but knowing you, Phoebe, I'm willing to bet you did this. I bet your frontline OBS employees had to have some type of specialized training before they were allowed to work those cars. Tell us about that. What did you develop?
3 days. I had a person working for me that I got out of HR, Barbara Hanna. And
Yes,
Barbara is brilliant in her
she is.
organizational skills and her writing skills. And she and Pat Gallagher, I mentioned earlier, developed the training for the Starlight along with me. And it was everything about the details of service, the morning breakfast service, the wine tasting, the dinner service, everything. And but it was tricky because we were not able to get a separate class of employee, through the union, a special designation. And so when someone left the parlor car, it went up for open bid. And so from time to time, we did get people that didn't quite have the skills. And we dealt with that first by trying to help them. But
Sure.
if it was clear they didn't understand what we were trying to do with the parlor and didn't care or didn't believe in it, then the union was very good to us in letting us disqualify that person, because that person would not be fired. They would just have to work another train and more appropriate. So they could work any other train out of LA, including the Starlight main lounge, but they couldn't work the parlor if I disqualified them. And so we trained for every detail, because you can never do enough training, in my opinion. And parlor car was the most difficult job, in my opinion, to do right, because it'd never been done before. There'd never been a service like that. And we really wanted to make it a special, really wonderful service. And so, yeah, training was always a part of it, Griffin. 3 days worth.
They're in LA or on the job on the car itself?
The training was in LA in the yard with the equipment.
Okay.
With Barbara, with me, with existing parlor car employees being taken off their run to be the trainers. Who better to train people than someone who's a master at the job already? So we would use almost all the people that worked the parlor were fabulous, but we would use a couple of the existing 10 parlor car attendants to do the training with new employees with the Starlight.
Okay, so Phoebe, you're product line director on the Starlight. What happens next?
Well, probably the only job I ever turned down. I turned down the vice president's job in Chicago when Al Edelston went to back to Florida, and Lee wanted me to come to be his vice president to help him. And I turned it down because Gil Mallory wanted me to stay and said, you just can't leave. And anyways, I stayed for another 2 years, but it angered the president of the company, George Warrington, severely. And he was livid that I had, in his opinion, selfishly stayed on the Starlight instead of going to Chicago to help the inner city and help Lee. So it was very tense. I thought he might fire me. He talked about firing me, and I had a lunch with him where I just tried to tell him I was sorry he was so disappointed, and I then told him that I would go to Chicago if another vacancy opened up. Another reason I didn't want to go was my kids were not at a point in their school career where it made sense for them to have their life disrupted. That was a big thing for my two children. So anyway, Ed Walker was wonderful enough to offer me a general manager job, Great Trains of the West. So,
Yes.
and the plan was to make those trains like the Starlight, the Builder, Empire Builder, the California Zephyr, and the Southwest Chief. I was to turn all of them into similar versions of the Starlight. But what's the first thing? I had a budget crisis with cutting jobs and cutting service and amenities. And so I'm afraid that dream never took hold, because I thought, hey, if I can do it on the Starlight and then do it on some other trains, I might change the whole company, but that was a bit of fantasy because of the reality of the inner city and financial difficulties. So I had the general manager job for 2 years, and then was offered the vice president of the Eastern Region customer service in Jacksonville, again replacing Al Edelston, who had retired or was retiring. And so I went to Jacksonville, and then I had Florida Trains, Lakeshore Limited, Capital Limited, City of New Orleans, and Crescent and Auto Train. And that only lasted a year because Mr. Gunn arrived, David Gunn, and eliminated all the vice president field jobs. And
That's
so then
right.
I went back to superintendent, working for Don Saunders, of the Western trains that I had before as a general manager. And that was fine. And until Emmett Fremo, who had returned to Amtrak and was the vice president of customer service, asked me to work for him as senior director of customer service. And I would have 24 managers whose entire focus was to ride trains and evaluate service and look for ways to improve service, a job I thought would be right up my alley. And so that was 2004. And I had that job for 3 years. And then we had an unfavorable labor decision that contested those jobs as violating a union agreement, even though we've been assured they were A-OK by labor relations. They were not when it went to referee arbitration. And then I became the head of product line development, went to Washington to work for Emmett again. And that was the last job I had for the last 5 years at Amtrak, was product line chief of product lines. But again, I liked it because it was developing service and working to see how we could improve the trains. We had federal mandates, you may recall, PREA 210, where
Yes.
trains had to be evaluated to determine what could be done to improve financial performance, almost like what I was doing for free for Don Matthews in 1977, trying to get out of the tariff department. So
wow, what a full circle comment. Okay, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, that's exactly right.
But the thing I didn't like about the product line job, even though it was the highest rate of pay and highest level I had gotten to, was that I really wasn't involved with the customer anymore. I was a designer. I was an analytical guy. I was doing financial analysis and service ideas, but I didn't have employees, and I couldn't work my magic anymore because we weren't part of the same team anymore. And so I was indirectly involved with them, but that's not the same as being in the same tent and being
Right.
one team together. So that was the one negative about the product line, is I never really had any direct customer service opportunity. It was all analysis, which I think I'm actually very good at, but it isn't what I love. I don't love doing it because I don't get the reward that you get from
Surely.
service improvements and seeing the customers or hearing the customers tell you they love what you're doing. So
I just think of the many times that Joy Smith, the iconic Joy Smith, would tell me that you had flown here, there, and yonder to speak to NARP, to speak to the mayor of so and so. To you were constantly cheerleading the
I did.
the
I did
corporate goals.
public speaking and enjoyed it. And, particularly during the Starlight years, it just gave me a chance to tell the story in my own words about what we had done with the train, and always emphasizing the greatness of the employees, and that was the mission of the managers and myself, was to help them fulfill their greatness. Even if they themselves didn't believe it, we told them we knew better, that we were great. And a brief story, the UTU, the conductors general chairman, he went on to be president of the UTU, Dirk Sampson, based in Portland. A very difficult guy to work with. At least that's what I thought, and being in management, there were a lot of arguments we had. And then I decided I was going to put a service guarantee in, not like the one that later was done with Ann Hoey. And, this was a targeted service guarantee. It did not apply to on-time performance because I didn't control it. It didn't apply to mechanical because I couldn't control the propriety of that. It was about the service experience. If a customer didn't feel that they had had a great service experience, I would give them their money back. And it came to me when I stayed at a DoubleTree Hotel in San Luis Obispo, and they missed my wake-up call, and I came down to check out. I mentioned it to them, and they took my bill back and said, "It's on us." I said, no, you don't have to do that. And they said, "No, we do have to do it because we did make a mistake, and we want your business." And that got a light bulb, thinking, I could do that with the Starlight. My employees are good enough that I can do that service guarantee, and I won't have to pay a lot, because I'm going to remind them they can do anything in the book, not in the book, take care of the customer, and we will tell stories about the great things they've done. And I thought I could maybe keep the number of service guarantee payments to very low. And so I worked on this for quite some time, the law department, everything, and my managers, and we launched it uniquely on the Starlight, the service guarantee. But the day we launched it, I got a call from Dirk Sampson. This is how difficult it was. And Dirk said, "Are you out of your goddamn mind doing a service guarantee on a train? Do you understand what's going to happen?" And I said, "Well, no, tell me, Dirk, what's going to happen?" And he said, "These customers are going to come up with some bogus reason, and they're going to say they had a bad experience, and you're going to give them their money back. The whole thing is a scam. They probably didn't have a bad experience, but they know that you've got the deep pockets, and you're going to give the money back to them. And worst of all, then you're going to turn around and find out who the employee was that caused the problem, and you're going to fire the employee." And I said, "Dirk, no disrespect, but you are 100% wrong. No employee is getting fired. And you can quote me on it, and if you'd like, I'll put it in writing. No employee is going to get in trouble for a service failure. But I want employees to know that they have the power to do everything to prevent a service failure, and I will back them. They will never get in trouble for doing something not in the book. You can quote me on that, and if you put it all in writing, Dirk." I said, "But here's the bottom line. You've got it backwards, Dirk. I'm doing this because I believe in the employees of the Coast Starlight. I wouldn't do this if I didn't think they were great. The conductors, the onboard attendants, the station people. I have some of the greatest employees in the history of Amtrak working the Starlight, including you, Dirk, and including those conductors out of Portland who do a fabulous job. And that is why I'm willing to do a service guarantee, because I believe that they are great enough that we will be successful. And the greatest end of the story is that we averaged one service failure per 90,000 customers, 12 per million. And it
Wow.
was all because I believed in them. And I turned Dirk's criticism and his cynicism, I tried to turn it into a positive, to say I believed in them. And when I left the Starlight, one of the great honors, we had a farewell party, and Dirk came and he said, don't tell anyone that I'm here at a management person's retire or leaving the LA party. He said, but I'm going to say something about this person. We fought a lot, but I will say this. He really believed in his employees. And I said, Dirk, you can't pay me a better compliment than that. So thank you for being there. So, everything we did had controversy, and, there were people that maybe thought I'd lost my mind. The parlor cars, a good example, the service guarantee, the onboard entertainment, everything we did was challenged by critics and cynics, and like Theodore Roosevelt said, the man in the arena, that's who you want to admire, who knows failure as well as success, but he's in the arena and he's not sitting back in the gallery taking shots at you while doing nothing. And so I just figured I had to go for broke, and I had to try everything that I thought could make us greater as a service company. And I think I was able to do a lot of that, Griff.
And you did, Phoebe. You did across 4 decades, and there's still parts of Amtrak Onboard service that have your fingerprints all over it, and thank God that some of that is still left today. My personal prediction, just my personal opinion, because of your legacy, I think we will be forced to return to that again because of the groundwork you've laid.
That would be gratifying. Yeah. One never knows, Griff, how things work out, but that's a delightful possibility to think of, Griff.
I've seen it happen, and so have you. So have you. You've seen this company come full circle. When you think they're up here, all of a sudden they're back down here on the right page again.
Amen.
You have been so honest and kind to allow me to probe my next question, and that is, and I do personally know a little bit about this. I don't think anything to your level, because I never achieved the rank in the railroad industry that you did. But I'm talking about corporate Amtrak. But all of these years, you also held a deep, dark secret. And
Indeed.
and I can't imagine. I don't know how to start asking that question, so I won't. Tell me what I'm trying to ask, because I can't imagine. I know it was difficult from my perspective. I cannot imagine what it was for you. I can't.
Yeah. Well, it was difficult. I never told my parents. They both died, and I think they would have been good with it, but I was too frightened. So the story of Phoebe and my embracing Phoebe belatedly just after I retired from Amtrak is a story of fear and a kind of, not just a secret, but a sense of shame and embarrassment. I would ask myself, I wasn't a religious person, but I would say, how does God if there is a God, create a man's body, fairly normal looking, but a desire to be female. It just seemed almost like a cruel joke. And so as I was growing up, the desire started probably when I was 8 or 9, and I didn't know what to make of it. And I started secretly dressing up when I was, I think, 12, 13, and was hoping no one would find out. And all along, I thought, I can never tell anyone about this. This is just, I'm probably mentally ill. I probably sick in some way, and then I don't want anyone to find out. And then when I went to work for Amtrak, it was more a question of concern that this desire to be a successful and high-ranking Amtrak employee would be destroyed if I came out as a young Phoebe back in the 1970s. So I made a commitment in my mind that I would keep this a secret. I did do some entertaining at a place called the Barn in Washington when I was in the operating department, but the only people who ever knew were gay men who frequented that club and knew about, my desires. Bill Tucci, who himself, had been in the closet for being gay and all, but basically no one at Amtrak knew. And then I met a woman that I fell in love with, and when we moved to Boston, I'd met her in Washington. I proposed to marry her, and she said she could not marry me because she had found a female wardrobe and that I had something going on the side, and she just couldn't handle marrying someone with a side relationship or extra woman. And I said, well, there's some very good news. There is no other woman, and the bad news is that's my wardrobe, because I love to get dressed up, and I don't know why I get the desire. I don't understand it, but I just know it's very powerful, and it's just deep within me. And so she said, I will marry you, but you have to promise me, if we have children, they can never know. I never want to see you do it. You have to keep it secret, and no one can find out, and no one can find out at Amtrak because it'll destroy your career, etc. So I immediately said yes to that, because I still saw it as an illness on my part, something to be ashamed of, and I was ashamed of it, but I could never stop the desire. And so, Griff, this is almost pitiful to say, but on some of my trips on the Starlight and other trains, and in my long career, I would take a suitcase with 2 wardrobes, and the wardrobe of Brian, and then the Phoebe wardrobe, and I would decline dinner invitations with employees and things, and I would work on being Phoebe in the hotel room, but was petrified to leave the hotel room. So I say this with no exception. I did it in the hotel room and never left the hotel room. And that's the sad story. I figured if I left and went downstairs to the restaurant or the bar or out on the street, employees would see me and I'd be outed, or just, it would destroy my career. So that's how sad my life was. Meanwhile, being a dad and a father is one of the greatest things ever. And, my Amtrak career was certainly great and all, but I was struggling horribly during 30 years of marriage to my now ex-wife. And then when my second child got married, I said to her, my wife, I said, I am done keeping this a secret. It is not bad. It is not mental illness. It's just something I was given. And I don't even think it's a bad thing. I think maybe it's a good thing, because something that makes you this happy and doesn't harm anyone, why should I feel ashamed about it? So I am not going to keep it in the closet anymore. I was 61 when I retired from Amtrak. And she said, what are you saying? And I said, well, we can find a compromise. Maybe the weekends I can be Phoebe, and weekdays I'll go back to Brian. And she was one of the wives of a transgender person who said, absolutely not. If you're going to do that, I don't want you to be a part of my life. And so I ended up leaving our home and moving to Rogers Park, to the very building that I am in right now, and an old hotel, Sherwin-on-the-Lake. And I came out right here primarily because the people here at this building had such goodness and such kindness and such willingness to give me support. I came out at a Halloween party shortly after I moved in October, and I'll never forget the maintenance guy, Andy. I went to him on the 15th or so of October for Halloween and said, Andy, I got to ask you something. I'm thinking of coming to the Halloween party as a female military general in a micro mini skirt. And he said, well, what's the question? And I said, well, I don't want to ruin the Halloween thing if I walk in and people's jaw drops. And he said, you don't know the people in this building. He said, they are not going to be hateful about it. They might make fun of you, but it will be good natured. And he said, you come however you want to come. Don't even give it a second thought. The Halloween party, it says you pick the costume. So you want to come as a female military general, a micro midi skirt, looking like a hooker, as one resident said to me. That's okay. And anyways, that night, 31st, I realized I could do anything. I didn't have to be frightened. I didn't have to worry. I didn't have to have panic attacks. That if I could just be myself, the same personality, and confident that what I was doing was good, a chance to meet people. I could poke fun at myself to disarm people that might have awkwardness. And I say this with no hesitation. I've been Phoebe for 10 years, almost 11 now, and I have never had a bad experience. And my wife did me a favor by not agreeing to a compromise. I was able to go Phoebe all the time. And then I got involved with the wine shop, and that was all Phoebe. And then everything I did in life was as Phoebe, and it was a dream come true. I would rank it right up there with the Coast Starlight and Amtrak and many other.
Okay.
But the thing I learned is that if you're just yourself and you come across as authentic and not hostile or defensive, but just give people a chance to digest who you are, and they've been great. They've been great everywhere I have gone. I took a cruise to New Zealand, and the cruise director made me the centerpiece at a captain's dinner. And everywhere I've gone, the kindness has never been forgotten. And so I have lived as Phoebe since 2013 and into 14, where I became full-time, and the wine shop was a big part of Phoebe. And that's when I started meeting other transgender people, and it maybe helping them overcome their fears that being transgender really wasn't very scary at all if you believe in yourself and you have a certain confidence that you're a good human being, a decent human being, and that'll bring out the good in other people, which has been the lesson I've learned from being Phoebe. So it was 50 years of suppression and 10 years of incredible happiness as Phoebe. And I'm sitting here with the very first person I met when I moved to the Sherwin, and a friend of incredible just goodness and kindness and brilliance. And I used to come over to Jim's before I got sick, and we'd talk till 4 a.m. and then walk home in my mini skirt. And, not the wisest thing, of course, but it was fearless. So I didn't want to start worrying that something bad would happen to me in the 5-block walk to my condo from here. And but anyways, Jim Lou is an example, the greatest example of the friendship and the support and the camaraderie and just the outright pure pleasure of getting to know him.
Phoebe, my heart just embraces your whole story. But I want to ask you something from my perspective. Don't you think in the 70s or the 80s, if you had chosen this time to be yourself, it would have stopped your Amtrak corporate career, wouldn't it?
Yes, and we've had presidents that are openly anti-gay and
absolutely.
I think 40 years ago, we'll say 40 to 50, I think if I'd come out then, the career would have been over. Probably my marriage in 1980 would never have made it. I don't think I'd have the joys of being a parent, a father, that I did enjoy. But so keeping it a secret was not without its purposes, but it was sad nonetheless to feel like you couldn't see a pathway to ever being Phoebe in public and being able to share it with anyone at all. Not even my sainted mother knew, and yet I think she would have been amazing. And I'm saddened that I couldn't overcome my fears at that time to tell her, and I really couldn't tell anyone. And yes, my career, there is no way that I would have been able to do the things I did with the Starlight and other trains and the wonderful legacy I've been a part of if I'd come out. That's my opinion of what it was like in the 70s to be what they called it, being a transvestite or cross-dresser back then. And word transgender didn't exist. But yeah, I think I would have been identified as a freak, and then I would have been isolated career-wise, and I think it would have been a disaster. So I probably did the right thing, but it didn't make it any less painful to have a secret that you carry for 40 years and can't share with anyone because of your fear. But it worked out, right? I mean, at 61, it was almost like a second adolescence. I remember one night I was dancing on the wine bar in 4-inch heels, and the customers would come off the wine bar and end up in the hospital. And I'm thinking, this is like better than being a teenager, and I'm just living all the things that I couldn't live earlier in life. And so 61 to 70 was a pretty grand time for me, and a chance to fulfill a dream that I think as I got older, I wasn't sure I could ever do it, that I'd ever get a chance, but I did. And it's just part of yet another reason why I feel such gratitude for the people that I've encountered in life that have been so supportive and so willing to embrace my eccentric nature.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, because of your willingness to suffer alone, because you were willing to do that, we, not only employees, but especially our passengers, look at the greater service we were able to see and experience and feel and touch because you suffered alone.
Yeah. Well, then it was worth it. I'm sure you agree with me, Griff, that life is, in the end, sometimes about finding the right balance, and sometimes there's no good decision to make, only bad ones. And you pick the least bad when you make a list of different options, try to figure out the path forward. And sometimes there isn't a clear path of total happiness. You give some of that up, but I mean, to be a father to 2 children, to the power of being a parent and the love that comes out of your soul, your heart, for responsibility for another human being, is that's the trade-off. So if I had to trade a chance to be Phoebe, to be a dad, or to be able to fulfill my dream with the railroad, it was a pretty good bargain. It may not seem that way to some, and maybe in a purely moral universe, you could say maybe I compromised in ways that I didn't have to. But I think my life would be different in many ways, not all of them good, if I had come out when I was in my 20s.
I can definitely see that. Thank you for breaking the glass ceiling that you broke. You know what? Thank you for appearing on this podcast. I have no idea who watches these, but I guarantee you have been of maximum service to somebody by your courage and willingness to share. There's somebody that's taking a deep sigh of relief, saying, thank God that she has the courage to say what she said, and that you can achieve, because look at what you achieved. You've just made it easier for somebody else.
Right. Well, there isn't a better compliment you could ever pay me than the idea that I helped someone else with something in their life that needed some help, and to know that I was able to provide some help is the highest calling a person like me can ever have, is to know that maybe I made a difference for the betterment of another human being. I couldn't ask for more than that, Griff.
Well, you humanize spirituality, and thank you for humanizing spirituality, for, or at least for me, spirituality is such a broad topic. Like, well, what the heck is the, you have humanized spirituality. I can see you and hear you and know you're there, and know and saw most of what you accomplished firsthand. And some other young person right now is going to be able to do the same, because you had the courage to be who you are today. What have I left out? What do we need to know? What needs to be said in the Phoebe Snow story, that, if you know what, I do try to say this in every podcast, who knows, but 100 years from now, if this tape exists and somebody's playing it back and hopefully saying, man, I can't believe these things were even issues, how didn't those folks back then have something else to worry about? But what do you need to say?
Well, I look at life as an odyssey, a journey of sorts, and I've tried to cover with you what that journey was like. And again, mentioning people like Ron Scalero and others, Jim Lou, and who have helped me achieve things that I never could have done on my own. So I think, from my point of view, I'd like to be remembered as someone who had passions for very special things, but achieved what I achieved with the gift of kindness and support and wisdom and care that came from so many other people. And I was blessed that they were part of my life. I mean, Griff, to be honest, to go from a reservation agent to a regional vice president, I mean, really, that is pretty hard to believe. And when you're 7 years old and you're thinking, I want to run a railroad, and you come pretty close to it, it's humbling to realize how much you were able to accomplish. But I never forget that the accomplishments are really only in part mine. I might deserve some credit for learning the art of helping other people at Amtrak reach their greatness, but most of my success is because of the wisdom and the intelligence and the brilliance of other people who shared their time and even their love for me. I can think of no greater sense of purpose than that, Griff. And I think you've covered the journey pretty well. You know, I had wanted to tell a couple stories, and I did tell them, and I will just say, Griff, as you know, the last 10 years have been quite wonderful. The last 1 year has been very difficult, you know, with health issues that are life-threatening. And even then, with facing mortality, I'm struck by the goodness of people, the kindness of people, the support of people, the passion and love and affection that has, I mean, even my ex-wife, who barely spoke to me for the last 10 years, came out of nowhere and has been a wonderful human being in a way that I can't remember her being this way for 10 years, 15 years. And that goodness is what I married her for, and it was gone, and it seems to have come back. So even illness, Griff, is sometimes an opportunity to appreciate the wonderful nature of humanity. So I will tell one more small story that maybe relates to this. I used to have to fly a fair amount, you know, back. I'd take the train one way, fly back, and it was in the airport. And
Are you talking about between Chicago and Washington or Chicago and LA?
yeah, it was. I was on the West Coast, and I was actually coming back from an Australia trip, which is yet another thing. Amtrak West hired to do Victoria Railway service. Here I am in
Right.
I mean, good God, it doesn't get too much more exciting than that. But in the airport, I bought a book called Proof of Heaven. You know, there are all these books about people that die temporarily, and, you know, their
Sure.
stops or something affects them, and they describe the experience. And, you know, they're often very religious, and they see maybe Jesus or God or something like that. But anyways, this was a doctor at University of Memphis, and not a believer. And he got meningitis of the brain,
Oh,
which is
wow.
not common. And he deteriorated rapidly, and they induced and put him in a coma because they were trying to save his life. And they had decided that he was probably not going to survive. And if he did survive, he would have such brain damage that it might not be a good idea to survive. But anyways, he was in that coma for 12 days. And then his body somehow began to heal. They did use treatments, various drugs. But anyways, the great story is that he came out of the coma. They brought him out of the coma, and he regained consciousness. And most miraculously of all, he never suffered brain damage. And so he was able to go back to being a doctor at the University of Memphis. But in the book, he writes about his memories of the 12 days. And it reads like Alice in Wonderland, you know, a maze, a garden, lights, flowers, you know. And he saw his parents, you know, who were gone physically from the world. And sometimes it would be dark, and he'd see dark images, and they were scary to him. But it was mostly joyous, and he said profoundly passionate for him to have these feelings that are hard to describe because you're clinically dead, but you remember these images of love, of seeing parents who are gone and hugging them. And anyways, it's a lovely book, and it doesn't have the religious overemphasis that so many of them do. And at the end of the book, he says, the following. He says, I don't know about God, and I don't know about an afterlife, and I don't know about heaven and hell, and I'm really not able to know any of this stuff. And I respect people who believe in those things and people who don't. But I know one thing that I learned forever, and I dedicate the rest of my life, however long I have, to this, is that the purpose we have here on earth is to love and to be loved. And he said, of the two, to be able to love someone else is the greatest of all joys, because it comes up from within, and it's a feeling that it cannot be rivaled. It's what makes us human, and it's the purpose of our life. And I am devoted now for the rest of my time to sharing that message. So I look at my life as being like Dr. Mendelssohn's thing, which is, to love others and to be good to others and to bring kindness to others and to make people happy, and to see how many people have been willing to do that for me. I could never ask for anything more powerful and gratifying than that. So I should just mention that, because I think my career at Amtrak is a product of the ability to love and the ability to appreciate people and see the good in almost everyone, and to hope that I measured up in some way to people's expectations of my goodness, and to hope that I made a difference, just like you said earlier, that I might have helped someone on their journey. If I have, I can go to my resting place. They're very, very honored that I was lucky enough to be able to do that for other people.
Well, make no mistake ever, please. You are beloved by your coworkers. You are beloved by your employees. You are beloved by your passengers. And you are loved by me. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that rigorous honesty, which
You're yet
thank
a
you.
great example of what I'm saying. To have met you and gotten to know you is one example of what I'm saying. Joyce Smith, another one, and
Sure, yeah.
yeah, another one. It just amazes me that I was lucky enough to meet so many people that have brought such warmth and goodness into my life. I can never thank all of them enough, but I'm going to try to do that.
Well, we need you. Don't go anywhere.